Hey there, and welcome to Rob's Custom Wood Shop. My name's Rob, and today I'm going to be building this awesome entryway bench with storage underneath the walnut top and the optional basket storage. I'm building the carcass for this bench out of a piece of 3/4 inch shop grade birch. It only requires a 3 foot by 6 foot piece, so to maximize the waste I cut that off first. Then, referencing my cut diagram, I use green tape to lay out and mark all my pieces, before breaking down the sheet into more manageable pieces to take to the table saw. Once at the table saw, I continue to cut all my pieces to rough width. Now that all the pieces are rough cut, I start cutting them down to final width and taking off the factory edge. Then I switch to the crosscut sled to square up and cut all my pieces to final length. While doing this, I cut the pieces that are the same length on top of each other so that they remain the identical length. Now I believe it's a good idea to lay out and mark all your dados and rabbets, because from personal experience, it really sucks to have to go through the whole setup procedure just to cut one dado that you forgot. Once everything's marked out, I put the dado blade into my table saw and install my sacrificial fence so I can start cutting all the rabbets. Once the rabbets are done, I can then start cutting the dados. To make sure the dado is spaced equally, I cut one dado and then I flip the piece end for end and cut the second dado. And just like cutting them to length, I cut all the dados with the same measurement at the same time. The dado for the back dividers is a little bit trickier. It requires a drop dado and a stop dado, because the dado does not go all the way through to the opposite side. Before picking up the piece, it is very important to let the blade come to a complete stop. Just using a chisel, I quickly pare out the material that was left from the cut. Once that's all cleaned out, it's time for my favorite part, the dry fit, to check and see if all the cuts I just made fit together. And it turns out they do. So, what else do you do in this situation but a happy dance? Once I'm done celebrating, I take everything apart and give it a thorough sanding up to 220 grit before I start assembling. For the assembly, I just use glue, and I make sure I get glue on all 3 surfaces of the dado, just so I get a good bond. Once I get all the pieces together, I start adding clamps, and as per usual, I may go a little overboard on clamps, but the end product came out perfectly square, so I guess I did something right. To attach the face, I just use glue, and then I secure it in place with a couple of brads until the glue cures. Now that the carcass is done, I can shift my attention to the lower support. For this, I'm using a 2x6. I rough cut it down to 2 inches before taking it over to the jointer. There, I flatten one face, and then using that face against the fence, I flatten one side. Now before taking it over to the planer, I take it to the table saw and I cut it to about 1 1/16 inches to reduce planing time getting it down to 1 inch. And then just a couple of passes through the planer and I had my stock right where I wanted it. And then back at the table saw, I trim my piece to final width. Now that my stock is milled, I cut a rabbet a 1/2 inch wide and the thickness of a piece of plywood deep out of each of my pieces. I'm wrapping these pieces around the carcass using mitered corners. With just a few trips to the miter saw, I get the perfect fit. Then I shoot a brad in each end to temporarily hold it in place. And then piece by piece, I finesse them all to a perfect fit, using a piece of cutoff to help me mark. Once all of the bottom is temporarily attached, I set a marking gauge and I go all the way around the whole bottom 3 inches from each end and make a scribe line. Then on the bench, I fill in my scribe line with a pencil so it's easier to see. Then I mark out 3 inches from each end, and then using my trusty can, I draw a nice little curve. Then once all the pieces are marked, I take it over to the bandsaw and I very carefully cut really close to my line. Just FYI, I am getting better at this. Once I get all the pieces cut at the bandsaw, I take them over to the router table and I give the inside of the legs a really good round over before installing them. And for this, I use glue and some 1.5" brads to attach the feet to the carcass. Then I cut some thin strips to use as edge banding to seal up the faces of the plywood. I used glue and the tape trick to hold them on while the glue cured. So to add some decoration to this, I used this 1x6 to create some false drawer fronts. I run it through the milling process to get this board to 3.5 inches wide by 1/2 inch thick. And then at the miter saw, I rough cut all 3 pieces to around 10 3/4, and then I cut them all at once to make them exactly the same length. And then I took the pieces over to the router table where I installed my raised panel bit, and this gave me just that extra little bit of decoration. And then I took them over to the carcass, just using glue and brads. I attached them to the face, and now the only thing left to build is the walnut top. So here we go again through the milling process. At the miter saw, I cut all the checks and cracks out of the ends, and then I moved over to the jointer where I jointed one edge on each of the boards. Now these boards are too wide to face joint on my jointer, so I used that jointed edge against my table saw fence, and I cut my boards down to about 5 3/4 so I could face joint each board. Now one of my boards had a nasty cup, so I face jointed it till that cup was gone, and then using the planer, I brought all the boards to the same thickness as that one. Then I just had to clean up the edges at the table saw, and I was ready for a glue up. I apply a liberal amount of glue to one edge of each of the boards, and then I lined up each piece using a mark I had put on before installing clamps on each end to hold the ends secure. And then I put one caul in the middle to keep everything aligned while I clamped it up. Now I have to say, doing a glue up like this is the best argument I have to go buy a good jointer, because just using very light clamping pressure, these joints pull together perfectly without any gaps. Then once everything was out of clamps, I scraped off the squeeze out and sanded everything up to 220 grit. Then I took the piece over to the table saw, squared up one edge, flipped it over, and cut it to the proper width. Then using the crosscut sled, I squared up one side, flipped it over, and cut it to length. Over at the router table, I used a 3/8 round over bit to do all 4 sides, top and bottom. Once that was done, I took the piece back to the table saw and I cut it for the hinged piece. I used green tape to help protect against tear out. And then I took the piece back to the router where I used a straight cut bit to cut the mortise out for the hinge to sit in both halves. Once the mortise was cut on both pieces, I attached the smaller piece to the carcass. To do this, I applied glue only on the back of the carcass, and then using a homemade jig, I centered it and used a few brads just to hold it in place, hopefully allowing for wood movement. I used wood filler to seal the plywood edges that were still exposed on the top and the sides, and then I filled the nail holes as well. Once it was dry, I sanded everything flush again, and then it was ready for finish. First, I primed the carcass, and then give it 3 coats of white paint, sanding lightly between coats to keep a smooth finish. And then on the top, I wiped on 5 coats of spar urethane, sanding with 400 grit in between each coat. Now that I see the finished product, I'm deciding that the gray baskets aren't the look I'm going for, so I think I'm going to order some brown ones. But other than that, this was a fun build using hardwood, plywood, and some softwood. Do you have any tips, tricks, or questions on this project? Leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, please hammer that thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more of my videos, don't forget to subscribe and ring that little notification bell so you never miss when I upload new content. Thanks for watching and hope to see you on the next project.